Greetings to you and many thanks for joining us on Rwanda Television. By 2050, the African continent will be home to more than 1 in 4 people on the planet, and more than a third of the world's youngest population will reside in Africa by that time. And this unprecedented growth, also referred to Africa's demographic dividend, demands unconventional solutions from diverse stakeholders, especially the private sector, and to innovate for breakthrough opportunities for all, particularly the young people. And today, in our edition of 360 Degrees, we want to talk about an issue that is often left out, the issue of a refugee crisis on the African continent and beyond. And today, you might hear that we're talking about refugee crisis and maybe think the UNHCR is in the studio or more. But today, we want to focus on the role of the private sector in addressing the refugee crisis that has been emerging on the African continent for decades and decades, that needs urgent solution and collective efforts from both governments, from both partners, from both development partners, from the private sector in particular, which we want to talk about today. Established in 2019 by Isaac Kwaku Fokuo Jr., Amahoro Coalition provides proven tailored model focused on 4 interconnected areas: education, employment, entrepreneurship, and creating enabling environment that enables a private sector to capitalize on these opportunities to create sustainable market-based solutions, particularly in vulnerable settings, including refugee and displaced communities. And we are very much pleasured to have Isaac, the founder and CEO of Amahoro Coalition. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Right. I can start from a curious question. Amahoro Coalition, Amahoro in Kinyarwanda means peace. And in this time around, we're talking about a refugee crisis. If you can take us a bit back from the creation and the genesis of Amahoro Coalition, what is it and what did you intend? And what was the genesis or the origin of the name Amahoro?
Sure. Let me answer that 2 different ways. I think let me start with why we do what we're doing, and then also address the name, as you mentioned. You know, we live in a continent of 54 countries, and as you mentioned, the African continent has, by 2050, you're going to have a lot of young people. And everyone is talking about this dividend. But there's also a second part to the conversation, which is that if we don't catalyze that dividend very well, it could become a problem.
Yeah.
Currently, it's estimated that about 44 million people, plus or minus, are forcibly displaced. These are people who are either refugees, internally displaced, homeless, stateless, asylum seekers, what have you. That number is actually more than, it's close to about 40% or so of what the global displacement number is. And that's a big deal. The other thing is that currently the ongoing crisis is fueled by traditionally political instability, which has been something that our continent has known. But increasingly it's been through climate change. The effects of climate change has also been whether it's fire, the floods. Recently, we've seen floods in Kenya and other places. That's a big deal. Drought issues, people are being displaced all over the place. An interesting thing is that as a continent, we're not only just a producer of refugees and displaced persons, we're also the host of them. For instance, Uganda is the largest hosting country for refugees in Africa, with about 1.5 million people. Which 1.5 million people, if you take a bunch of islands in the Indian Ocean, whether it's Comoros and Sao Tome, Principe, Seychelles, and Sao Tome, that's essentially the population of those countries put together, and right. That's just the number of refugees in Uganda. Why does this matter, right? And why do we care about this? Well, to date, if you look at how the global response to refugees have been, there's always been a very short-term response. The idea of refugees will be that a country is in conflict. I go to a second country, I stay there for maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe I don't know, if for a temporary period, I go back to my country. In Africa, you have something what I call a protracted problem, right? So these issues go on for a very long time.
Right.
And in the process, what has happened is that traditional responses have been very short-measured, right? So you have things like provision of shelter and medical aid and food provisions by the UNHCRs, by the governments of the world, by governments. And those solutions have proven to be highly unsustainable. So what that's become then in the long run is that you have situations where you have millions of Africans who are now stuck in places where they've been there for sometimes 15, 20, more than 10 years. Some kids were born in these camps and they've lived in these camps, that's all they know. Now, governments by themselves can't solve this alone. our governments are stretched. African governments, we have to give African governments do a very good job of helping with this crisis. Like I said, African governments host refugees. Rwanda hosts a lot of refugees. A lot of countries host refugees. The international organizations do their part. So we decided that as private sector actors, what is our role in solving this issue? What role does the Africa private sector have, especially because the Africa private sector over the last decade or so has become very prolific. As I sit with you today, tomorrow we are starting the Africa CEO Forum. Right. Probably the most respected and largest CEO forum for African CEOs on the continent. It happens here. For a while, it was the WEF Forum. That was a big one. Now, the Africa CEO Forum is a very big deal in Africa. Yeah. So we have private sector actors and private sector captains. And the question we're asking ourselves is, what can we do to help solve what can we do in that situation? So Amahoro Coalition was started as primarily to focus on how private sector actors can do their part in mitigating and solving some of these issues. That's why when you mention things around education, entrepreneurship, things that are natural to private sector, employment opportunities, right? Advocating to governments for better policies, labor mobility for people who are entrepreneurs, and also, frankly, as a market. If you have 1.5 million people living in Uganda who are originally from Uganda, that's a market. If you have thousands of Africans living in a place where for 5, 6, up to 10 years they've lived there, they form an untapped potential for the economy in which they live. They become a resource for where they are, and we need to do a better job of tapping into that resource. So with all that in mind, we started Amahoro Coalition. Now the name, as you asked me, the name comes from Rwanda. It's a Kinyarwanda word. Right. It's a Kinyarwanda word because as we thought about how to set this initiative up, one of the things we kept thinking about is, what is the African best practice for what we're trying to do? Where in Africa have we seen the level of resilience, the level of sort of like picking yourself from the ashes and building from within? And Rwanda served as an example for us. Yeah. And I think when you look at, 30 years ago, interestingly enough, we're here 30 years after the genocide against the Tutsis. 30 years ago, what happened in this country and what government and the people of Rwanda have done to pick themselves up from where they came from to where the country is today and where the country is headed, it becomes a beautiful testament and a beautiful tapestry in identifying how to represent the conversation we're having. Right. So we chose Amahoro. It means peace, as you know. Yeah. And that's where that's where the name came from.
We're talking about this, I can say, in an ideal time where a refugee crisis is at the highest peak more than ever before, with conflicts all around the world spreading. And the more the conflicts, the more the wars, the more the number of refugees, particularly on the African continent. In terms of the private sector, it's a big problem, and I'm wondering where do we start while addressing this very huge matter that is, as you said, bigger than the governments in Africa, and where does the private sector start from this a problem that has been there for decades, unsolved? As you said, a person is born in a refugee, turns 30 years in the same refugee camp. So where do we start while addressing this problem? Because it seems very huge magnitude of problems in one.
You're absolutely correct. But the adage, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. Yeah. And so we have, for us at least, we have started our step. And our step is very simple. It's that we know that the African continent has some amazing private sector actors. We know the private sector can be advocates for change. We know the private sector in Africa are the largest employers of people. We also know that if private sector does its part to provide jobs and opportunities, perhaps the incidence of violence and political instability also goes down, because people eventually will live the life they want by having some sort of holistic prosperity. Yeah. So where do we start? We started by doing something very simple. We started in 2021 having the first Africa Private Sector Forum on Displacement here in Rwanda at KICC. Yeah. This was during COVID, during Omicron. We brought about 200 CEOs and government and stakeholders to Rwanda just to have the conversation, right? You have to have the conversation. You have to bring into the room people with lived experience, people from the private sector, from governments, from NGOs, to talk about how do we define the problem, and what can you do about it? And also understand some of the biases that we have for each other. The bias of, but this person is one other country. And you say to yourself, you know what, all of us Africans, someone said this once to me, that all of us Africans have sat in a classroom with someone who wasn't from that country, who was a refugee. But we never thought about it. Yeah. So the first step is a conversation. The second part of the conversation is now creating a trusted network of people who can actually say, I want to do something about this. Yeah. And getting them to commit to something. At Amahoro Coalition, we committed to a couple of things. The first thing we've committed to is to help find jobs, because we think jobs are important. So we work with private sector actors to identify employment opportunities for refugees, because we believe that a lot of people who are displaced are very talented and very skilled. Or they may not be, but given the opportunity, they can hold their rightful place in their own in society. Absolutely. So we help get jobs. The second thing we do is education. We focus on tertiary education because there's a lot of interventions when it comes to primary and secondary level. And our belief is that the next generation of leaders of Africa have to have some level of tertiary education. Not all of them, but we know that universities work. We know tertiary education is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We know that the incidence of Africans who go to universities is low. So we want to do our part to make sure that people who come from countries that have been displaced get access to tertiary education. We know, for instance, that if you are a young female from Somalia, your chance of going to university is much lower than a young female from Kenya.
Yeah.
But if we say that Somalia is a country that needs help in terms of conflicts it's been through, it's important to address issues of education in Somalia, and Congo, and South Sudan, and all these other places that have had some conflicts, right? So education is our second pillar. The third thing that we do is around this idea of this entrepreneurship. And through that, we have a fellowship program that we've launched where we identify high-performing young men and women who are doing amazing initiatives in their communities already. And we put them through a one-year fellowship program where we give them funding and we provide them mentorship to help them build and scale the initiatives. Now, the initiatives don't have to be business. You can say that I want to be the first female attorney general of country X. Yeah. I want to be a professor of, I don't know, entrepreneurship somewhere. Or you can say I also want to build the most amazing business in wherever. We will support you. We will support you. You come to the fellowship program, and once you're done, we give you full-on support to make sure that we help you achieve the dreams you want to achieve. Right. And then finally, we also then ask private sector actors increasingly to contribute something to the cause. So for instance, this time around, the thing we're pushing on very, very hard at this forum and moving forward is that we're challenging African private sector actors to contribute 1% of their resources toward this conversation. Just 1%. 1% of top line revenue. A company can say, I want to put 1% of my revenue into displacement in education. Right. Well, that's good. A company can say, I want to put 1% to further provide funding to the Amahoro fellows or entrepreneurs from displaced communities. Another person can say, look, I want to provide 1% of what I'm doing an investment in agribusiness project in a place of people from displaced communities live. Yeah. Whatever your 1% is, that's good enough. Yeah. And that's, to answer your question, that's where we're starting. Now, where that takes us, we'll find out. But for right now, the focus is that let's start somewhere, let's build together, let's build trust among this community, and let's figure out what we can take from there.
Before we can go into the practicability of this, I'm just wondering, it's been a few years since the start of the coalition. How is the operationalization going so far, and in what countries have you started working, and what picture has it already given in terms of the simple steps towards addressing this matter?
Sure, fair question. So in the fellowship program that I mentioned, we just launched our second cohort. The fellowship program was launched last year. Last year, we received over 1,000 applications for 15 slots for this fellowship. Yeah. We took the number down. We have 15 fellows who are going through the fellowship right now. These fellows are from the IDPs and refugees from Nigeria, from Togo, from some Malawi, Congo. We have someone from Ethiopia. Yeah. Someone else from, I said Malawi already, and I think South Africa. So we have about 7 or 8 countries represented in the current cohort, in Congo, in the current cohort. The next cohort that we're running, we are going through right now. We are looking to get up to 30 people, somewhere between 25 and 30 fellows into the program. And the goal is that between now and 2027 to have 120 fellows graduate from the program. Yeah. And these fellows who come through, they're also backed by up to $150,000 in funding for the initiatives you're running. So that's on the fellowship program. So the success right now is that we have 17 people who are going through it. We're going through a second cohort right now to actually build them up, and then we're gonna go from there. On employment, one of the most interesting things that has happened is that when we started this initiative, I was skeptical that it was going to be very difficult to find companies to contribute to this. As I sit with you today, we have commitments for over 2,500 opportunities for young men and women for jobs across the African continent. And this ranges from Nigeria to Ghana to Kenya to Ethiopia to all these other places. Yeah. And so we're looking to fill these slots. And this is sort of on the job placement program. We're also working with companies to look at how we can work with companies on joint initiatives. So try to figure out how do we solve some big problems around this conversation, right? How do we bring together things around sports? We're looking at sports as an initiative. Yeah. How do we build a coalition of of young people who are really interested in sports, not just the business of kicking or throwing, but the business of sports, and forming some partnerships around that. We have some partners who are working around that. We're working with telcos, with 2 telcos across Africa, to look at how things around payment platforms, things around making it easy for refugees to get paid when they work, things around connectivity, things around how people get connected to do jobs, for instance. So this is another coalition that we're working through. So these are sort of the partnerships that we've been able to form. And along the line, we formed some amazing partnerships with organizations like the UNHCR, obviously, because they're the custodians of refugees across the African continent, with MasterCard Foundation, and other partners that we're working with across the African continent on the initiatives.
Whenever something like this comes up, I always say politics or political will is the main driver when it comes to the realization of such initiatives. How do you work with governments and different other organizations to make sure that these policies and these good wishes and these goals that you're intending to achieve, these great ambitions can be achieved? Because sometimes, yes, the policies can be very good, yes, the goals can be very and extremely amazing, but when there is a lack of political will, absolutely nothing is going to be achieved. How do you work with governments and other organizations to make sure that these important steps are taken?
So, Sam, one of the things I've learned in my journey over the last few years is that there's sometimes an expectation that we wait for government to give us a directive. And I'm learning, and my team is learning that sometimes government is willing to work with you. You just have to ask. Right? And so in our experience, it's been a beautiful relationship because you do need to work with government on these initiatives. You cannot work in isolation from government. So for instance, when I mentioned in 2021, we had an event here in Rwanda. The government of Rwanda was very supportive of this event. The Prime Minister came to the event. We worked very close with the government here to make sure the event went on well, and it was very successful. At our last forum that we held, we had government officials from Nigeria, from Ghana, and Kenya show up, having these conversations, because government also needs help. Government also wants to understand how private sector's role can be in solving this initiative, because they can't do this alone. So it's not so much about policy. I think sometimes we as private sector actors, we don't do a good enough job of understanding how government works, to plug into government initiatives, to understand what government's frameworks are, to make sure that we're working in concert with government. And we're trying to do that. And so, for instance, I can tell you that we have a very good relationship with the governments of Ghana, the government of Kenya, and we're building these relationships either with government-based entities or the ministries themselves to actually have these initiatives going. And I think it's been a blessing to do that, because the level of collaboration has been very, very positive from our standpoint. In terms of other organizations, it's again collaborative, right? We're a multi-stakeholder platform. So whether it's a UNHCR, whether it's an IOM, whether it's anybody else, work with anybody, because for us, the goal is very simple. How do we get young Africans to find their rightful place in the continent in which they were born? How do we get these young Africans to make sure that when they get older, they have access to education, they have jobs, and whatever blessings they have, they've been able to action it. Who we work with, we're going to do that. We're going to do that well. But I think for us, the output is always important. We need these young people to be employed. We need them to go to school. We need them to make sure they're holding the rightful place in society.
As you said this, it actually popped into my mind that the urgency of solving the refugee crisis on the African continent, I can say the deadline was 10 years ago, maybe, if I may, because we still have a large number of young people, but also, say, the African population drowning every day in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to cross to Europe, and such initiatives could maybe contribute to addressing such matters. And do you see it the same way? Do you see issues, initiatives like Amahoro, a coalition contributing to reducing the number of young people trying to cross to the Western countries, thinking they could get a life there?
Yeah, look, I think people go through a lot to leave their homes for many reasons. And I guess when it comes to this issue of the Mediterranean, it's for economic opportunity. I want a better life for myself. I want my family to be in a better place than we are today. And if we can provide that on the African continent, why not? If the Amahoro Fellowship if because of the Amahoro Fellowship, a young person doesn't get on a boat to potentially drown or end up somewhere horrible, of course that's what we want. We want to keep our brains here. We drain the African brain every single year by putting it outside. And a lot of it, you're right, has to sometimes to do with the fact that people don't have the opportunities in their own countries. And so whatever we can do as private sector, and increasingly, I will argue that the African private sector has a pivotal role to play in that.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if everyone is leaving, who is the market? Right? If the people who are young, who are at the most productive time of their life is leaving, who are your employees?
Yeah.
There are many countries today who have a deficit in employment. We have plenty of people. How do we weaponize it, positively weaponize? How do we weaponize it for good? How do we make sure these young people are not leaving the shores of the continent? We need to create better conditions on our continent for them to stay.
Yeah.
Even schooling, you talk about people going to the Mediterranean, even school. Now in Africa, we have excellent education from some African education platforms. Most Africans who can, should stay and go to school in Africa.
Yeah.
Get employed in Africa. Because that's the only way we solve these problems. And so yes, absolutely. We believe that as part of our interventions, we hope that it will prevent young people from trying to leave to go someplace. And those who are going to leave, some will leave because for whatever reason. I mean, some will leave because of a better opportunity, and everything else. But I think for us, our goal is that if we can do something to prevent and reduce that number, then we're doing our job.
Yeah. What is the role of the mindset of Africans and the private sector in particular towards addressing this matter?
Mindset is a tricky one,
Yeah.
right? Because I think for a very long time, we haven't owned our conversations in a real way. And what that means to me is that even in this conversation we're having, it's always been a conversation of the other. I'll give you an example. In 2018, as we were thinking of setting up Amahoro up, we were approached by the UNHCR. At the time, there was a special envoy from Africa's office. Yeah. Approached us and said to us, hey, we want to understand why private sector doesn't get involved, what Africa private sector thinks about this conversation. So we did a survey of about 80 companies across East Africa to ask CEOs, are you familiar with this conversation around refugees? Are you doing anything about it? Does it matter to you? Does social impact actually matter to you? What became stunningly clear to me in that conversation was that it's not that Africa private sector actors didn't care, they just didn't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's one of these, and it's interesting when I say that because, again, like I said earlier, all of us have been to school with someone who was a refugee or a stateless person.
Yeah.
But somehow, me sitting next to my neighbor, Mohammed or Kwame or whatever, I have no idea what that guy's life is like.
Yeah.
And I become an executive, and so when someone is asking me, well, what about refugees? Asking yourself, what do you mean? And so one of the things that became very clear to me is that when you talk about mindset is that to shift the mindset, there's a lot of education that is necessary. And we're doing some of that. We have these CEO roundtables. We have every 6 weeks in different countries. We bring CEOs together and educate them on this conversation. Not from the point of view of a humanitarian thing, and these people are, from a point of view of markets and market-based solutions and actually opportunities and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think as we do that, some of the mindset shifts. The second thing about mindset is that as Africans, we need to shift from that mindset where we're speaking someone else's language. Because the language with which we speak and the lexicon with which we vocalize the things that we need become real. So for instance, if people are viewing us and labeling us as certain things as beneficiaries or whatever words people are using toward us,
yeah,
you start seeing yourself a bit as less than. Right? And that mindset shift has to become something where we're talking about it, we're talking about ourselves from a proud, positive perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that also shifts the mindset of whether it's companies or individuals, or even the people who are actually going to be clients of the conversation.
Yeah.
They see themselves differently. So I think mindset is a very, very interesting thing, but it's what I call a matter of the soul. It's something we need to work on all the time. At Amahoro Coalition, one of the things we're very big on is language. How do we talk about these issues? How do we address these issues? How do we make sure that we're not speaking the same language as government? Because government has a language to speak, and that's fine. International organizations have language to speak, that's fine. But us as people advocating from the private sector perspective, what is our language? What is our lane?
Yeah.
And how does that lane allow people to change the framing in their brains to advocate for things differently?
I raised this question because in my own perspective, the issue of ownership is still a big hindrance to owning such problems, which is why we do not even take necessary steps towards addressing the matter. And in terms of ownership, of course, mindset always matters.
No, it does.
Yeah.
It does. It does. And you know what? In that conversation, you said you can have an opportunity, but if your mindset, you're not ready to own it, you don't even see it. Right? And I think this, what we're talking about, actually goes beyond refuge. I think as Africans, there's a certain, and I say this sometimes, there's a certain thin layer of trauma that we've all been through, right? At different levels, And I think part of our generation and the generation coming up after us, well, my generation and the generation coming after us, is that we need to do a much, much better job of breaking the trauma because, you know, there's been what I call many revolutions in Africa. There was a revolution of independence, revolution of self-sufficiency, which we're still going through. But increasingly, I think one of the deepest things that we need to overcome is this trauma of self-doubt. This trauma of that we're not good enough, that we're less than, and that somehow something out there is better than us. But the truth is, if we believe it and we do it ourselves, it becomes real. And I'll give you a quick example of that. If you look at music, it's a very weird example, music. The biggest African stars today, whether it's Diamond Platinum, whether it's Burna Boy, pick an African artist, all of these people became big in Africa first before they became big overseas. And for me, that's a telling, right? Is that they didn't become big in Germany first or the US first. Burna Boy was a huge star in Africa, doing raga, becoming whatever, before he became Burna Boy all over the place, right? And I think the same thing is, for me, it's a very good lesson for Africans. It's like, believe in self and believe in identity and believe in what you're doing. The others will come to you if you believe in that yourself. But to do that, it's obviously harder than we say.
Absolutely. And now Amahoro coalition at the Africa CEO Forum, why does it matter? And you talked about something of, you know, trying to have our companies, the private sector, dedicate 1% of their shares to addressing the refugee crisis on the African continent. How do you plan to approach this matter, and particularly at the African CEO Forum? Yeah,
so at the Africa CEO Forum, we are having a side event on Friday in partnership with MasterCard Foundation. First, to showcase how businesses can play a pivotal role in labor mobility in Africa, right? So that's the first thing we're doing. And also bringing together stakeholders and private sector actors to ask a very simple question. Well, phrase, why they should get involved? Because it's not the what, it's not the who, it's the why. And so how do we talk, we're going to talk to private sector this week around why they should get involved in this conversation and why it's important for us to do so. The second thing is that even beyond the conversation we're having on Friday, as Amahoro, as I mentioned before, this is one of our mandates, is to catalyze the private sector to this conversation. So as a result, what we are launching, what we're talking about is that we want companies, African companies, to commit 1% of their resources in investing in sustainable solutions for displaced persons. That's it, just 1%, no more than that. Why? Because, well, first of all, it's a commitment we've made that we need to follow through. We made a commitment at the Global Refugee Forum. But secondly, we believe that this movement, if we can get companies to commit 1% of their resources this year, maybe 2% another year, maybe 3% another year, we start galvanizing support around this conversation in a way that's systematic, that actually allows companies to invest in the process organically, the way they want to do it. And it's very important for us to do that. So that's exactly what we're here doing. The second thing we're doing here is that we're bringing some of our young people to the forum. So we're bringing a young man, Zhang, who runs a company out of Nigeria where he takes electronic waste, makes them into power banks and provides energy. And we want to introduce some of our young entrepreneurs to the sort of the ecosystem of African CEOs, because we think it's important to do so. And so those are the two primary reasons why we're here. And also, you know, if we say that we work with Africa private sector, we should be talking to Africa private sector. But most importantly, I think that we believe that this 1% initiative is something that we'd like to push, because it allows companies to get in a conversation in a way that is natural and organic. You know, most companies have initiatives they run, whether it's on gender, climate change, what have you. When it comes to the refugee conversation, we have gender, we have climate change, we have education, we have everything. We have everything. And so companies, I think it's important, as I said earlier, to help companies understand the gravity of the issues, especially since a lot of these companies operate in this environment anyway. So it's something that hopefully will be consistent with their values, will be something that they can associate with, and do their part to solve some of the problems.
Isaac, you seem too optimistic when it comes to addressing this matter. Sorry for saying too optimistic, because considering how the problem is and how big it is and how long we've been having it, you seem too optimistic. My next question is, what gives you hope that we can really address this matter, considering how long we've had it and you know how big it is? What gives you hope?
So I'm not naive to think that Amahoro coalition can solve all of Africa's issues, right? That's not going to happen.
Right.
But this is what I know. I know for a fact that in the last 60 plus years of Africa's history, we've had transformative change. It hasn't been linear. It hasn't been a graph that goes up by itself. It's been a graph that goes up and down and sort of loops around, whatever. But my bet is that if you drew a line through the graph is trending to the right. And this is what I mean by that. There was a time in Africa before 1957 where we're not independent. We're all colonized. The independence movement came, African countries became independent. Not everybody, some became independent, some didn't.
Yeah.
And over time, we've gone through our struggles as a continent, and we're now where we are today. Africa as a continent is still very young. The oldest country in Africa is still less than 100 years old when it comes to independence. We're still very young. But I would argue that what we've achieved in the last 60 plus years as independent countries, by and large, probably far surpassed what other places achieved the first 60 years of their existence. And for me, that hope of the Africa spirit, that hope of Africans saying that, look, we need to solve some of these problems together. We need to harness the strengths and the resources we have to solve problems.
Yeah.
Is something that we need to focus on, because a lot of times we focus too much on the negative.
Yeah.
Right? Because the negative is always going to be there.
Yeah.
But there's resilience there, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier about with Amahoro. In 1994, after the genocide against the Tutsis, if the people of Rwanda decided that, oh, all is lost, where would you be today? So the examples of triumph, of resilience, of steadfastness that defines Africa's spirit.
Yeah.
And I strongly believe that with the rise of Africa private sector, which is now growing, Africans by nature, we are charitable. We have become more and more philanthropic. We have African captains of industry. We have African companies that are doing very well. Right now, as I speak to you, there's about $2.5 trillion of investable capital from Africa's private sector. We're not broke. We're not broke as a continent.
Yeah.
We talk about these resources. Our governments are working on beneficiation. Our governments are talking value-added services. We have this big dividend. China has used population to its advantage. India is doing that. Africa will do the same. Yeah. We just have to maintain the hope and maintain the spirit. We just have to hold on to the oar to make sure that no matter what happens, there'll be turbulent times. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. We're going to have some rough seas. But by and large, if we do the things we're doing and we self-correct and we start looking inward to fix some of these issues, I believe strongly that we will be able to achieve some of the things we're trying to achieve. Because ultimately, what's the purpose of all this stuff? Peace and prosperity for all. Yeah. The Africa we want, 2063, right? So am I naive enough to think that Amahoro by itself can solve things? Everything, no. But what I am sure about is that if we don't start, no one will. No one will. So someone else will join us. There'll be another Amahoro bigger than us. Yeah. There'll be another Amahoro who sees things differently, and that's okay. We need others to join the conversation. And you know, whether it's refugees, whether it's something else, but for us, this is a course we've picked to focus on. And we hope that we're able to have some level of impact in that space. What are some of the big barriers that are emerging for us to break? You mentioned a few of them. I think mindset is big. Mindset is bigger than we think. I think the mindset in actually believing that this is our problem to solve, right? And because I say that because for a long time we've been used to this problem being solved by others. Yeah. So conflict happens, camps are created, UN guys come, some NGO from outside comes and does whatever, and we're not in the conversation. Yeah. Right. But that's changing. So I think that's one of the barriers. The second, some of the barriers also happen are actually legitimately physical barriers, right? So you have new people in your country, our governments are stretched. Yeah. Governments are saying, how do I cater for these people? The right to work, the freedom of movement of people. If I can work, how do I get paid? You know, things like SIM cards, access to those things, education. Because of stretched resources, I think that becomes another physical barrier in sort of helping address these issues. Another issue is, frankly, the cause of these issues. Yeah. A lot of it is political instability. We need to stop fighting, right? We need to get our act together on some of these things, right? Yeah. That's not my pay grade. That's not why I sit. But the more we work together to solve some of our national problems, also some of this goes away. And another issue, which I don't think is a problem, I think actually it's an opportunity. It's with AFCFTA in the integration of Africa as a common market. I will bet that some of these spaces we're talking about are going to become clusters of economic development. And let me explain what I mean by that. Because when you have thousands of people moving to a space, and all of a sudden the private sector sees this as a market, the government start taxing this environment. Because if private sector sees opportunity, and all of a sudden I'm able to sell goods and services, I'm able to create whatever, I'm able to create opportunities there, a government will then change their attitude and say, okay, you know what, maybe we need to provide some services here. Yeah. Now all of a sudden these are taxable. If the talent makes sense, all of a sudden talent coming from that place benefits the country. What are we creating? We're creating an integrated Africa. So one of my arguments is that over time, I see these people, clusters of people who are moving around as pivotal to the integration of the African markets. Right. Because you're there. And the difference is that we haven't seen the opportunity yet. We are not seeing people. And when you see people, you provide opportunity, that's your new market. Yeah. And so that barrier has to be broken. The barrier of the tariff, the barrier of the other. Once you break that and you see that as actually this is the host community are one and the people are one.
Yeah.
Let's build a factory to employ both. Let's build a school that employs both. We all learn from this. We all benefit from this. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's another opportunity. That comes from the barrier.
I ask this considering the fact that recently, we were talking about this before we went on air, Rwanda made the initiative to receive some of the refugees that are stranded in the UK. You know, they get there, they can have the rights to stay in the UK, and from this, Rwanda signed an economic, an immigration and economic partnership deal with the government of the UK to have some of these people, instead of them staying stranded or living the extremely bad life, come here as they seek for going back to their home countries or getting a host country, as the government of Rwanda has been doing so for the past you know, many years. And to see the response of the people, including some of the Africans who know the magnitude of the refugee crisis on the continent, and just you know, opposing a country that has stepped up efforts to make sure that this can be addressed. It makes me wonder if we really know how big this problem is, or if we really should take the ownership to address this matter. And from this perspective, you yourself, what do you make of it?
You know, I find the whole dialogue very interesting for a couple of reasons. So what the government of Rwanda is doing now isn't the first time it's doing this, right? I remember a couple of years ago, the governments resettled Africans who were stranded in Libya. Yeah. I saw this on the news. A bunch of people were stranded in Libya, going through horrible conditions, were brought to Rwanda. Yeah. The government of Rwanda also, as I believe, settled some people from Afghanistan in the country. Yeah. Rwanda as a country has been through horrendous history, and a lot of Rwanda, well, actually every Rwandan has been a refugee at some point. Yeah. Most Rwandans have been refugees at some point, maybe not all. So when you see a country stepping up to help, and you see the cynicism, I struggle with that, because I'm not sure where that's coming from. I think some of it is politics, to be honest with you. Yeah. But I also think that, for me, I think it's a blessing the country says, I want to help solve this problem. Yeah. Because I don't see many countries raising their hands up to do this. I don't see many countries, and I think so. For me, I see this as a positive dividend, for the government to be doing, but also the people of Rwanda. Can you imagine, all of a sudden, people in Rwanda are able to sit next to, learn from, work with people from all over the world? That diversity, and how beautiful that diversity is. Yeah. Right? One of the most interesting things to talk about the US as a country is its diversity. Yeah. It's a country from all over the world. Diversity means something. And in this case, a government has said, look, I am willing to take people that are stuck in the middle, bring them to my country, while they figure their status out. Yeah. Some may stay, some may go, but at least they have a place they can live comfortably and call home for a while. I don't see the issue, personally. And for the work we do, I think that more and more countries should raise up their hands and do some of that, should raise up their hands to actually help with the problem. Because ultimately, you're either helping, you're either helping solve the problem, or you're part of the problem. Yeah. If you're a bystander, you might also be part of the problem. Yeah. So for me, I think everything we've talked about so far, I think, you know, as based on where this initiative goes, I see this as a big win for the country in terms of even the level of interaction that you're going to get with people. You know, most of us, look, I'm Ghanaian. If I grew up in my town, my city, Kumasi, it's a bunch of Ashantis, right? Yeah. Living in a country where you're having this level of diversity, I think is beautiful. Yeah. That's what idea spur, innovation comes about. I think it's great. Right? And again, like I said, some may decide to start businesses here, some may settle their families here, some may end up marrying people from Rwanda, and it's okay. That's the tapestry of the world. And at some point, maybe the peace will come in the country and they may go back. But I don't understand. Oh, I do understand. I think it also goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is that there's always this idea that out there is so much better than here. Yeah. And that mentality for me has a lot of shortfalls. Yes, there are many things that are beautiful out there, but also many things that are beautiful here. Yeah. And I think if we open our eyes to see that, and we see the beauty of that, then we understand where policies like that come from. So that's my standing on it. I think it's a great initiative, and I would love to see more of our governments raise up their hands to help solve problems. Absolutely. when it comes up. Yes, and as we draw maybe towards the conclusion,
Where do we see such initiatives in the few or many years to come, and what sort of solutions do we want to see Amahoro coalition contribute towards addressing refugee crisis on the African continent and maybe beyond?
A couple of things. I think, so the beyond part is that we would love to be a best practice for social impact across the world, and how we attract private sector to social impact, even beyond the refugee conversation. Because I think that is an important thing to do. I think increasingly businesses stand for good. Increasingly businesses understand that their value goes beyond shareholders, and they're equal citizens in this world. So the more they can do to create shared prosperity, obviously there's a benefit to them as well as a business, and good for humanity. So in terms of a macro objective, I think that's something we're very keen on.
Yeah.
I think the second thing that would love to see is that we would love to see that the work that we're doing at some point produces peace.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, through our fellowship program, if one of our fellows at some point becomes, I don't know, a very important person in the country that right now they can't live in because of political violence or what have you, it'd be great to see that person go back home and build something amazing. It'd be great to see one of our fellows become a titan in the country with the largest FMCG company employing 2,000 Africans. It'd be great to see young Africans interacting with other young people from around the world on equal footing. And the work we do should help push that. From the private sector angle, it'd be great to see African markets push frontier and work in countries where they're not working in today as a result of engaging with us. That if today a company from Ivory Coast is not in Somalia, but by engaging with us and getting to know some of our fellows and getting to know some of our clients, they choose to invest in Somalia someday, that'd be great. That's also what we're pushing for.
Yeah.
In terms of advocacy, we would love to see a situation where we're advocating for something positive in the African continent through government. For instance, one of the things that we're very passionate about is that when it comes to philanthropy, there are very few countries in Africa today that will you can get a tax credit from giving to charitable cause. Yeah. We want to advocate for that. We want to advocate our government to say, for every shilling, every dollar, every CD, every shilling, every Sudanese pounds you give to charity, you get a tax credit, because that will encourage more giving. And the more we can encourage more people to give on the continent as Africans, the more it also creates an enable environment for strategic philanthropy. Right. It's something that we also want to achieve. And I think those 3 or 4 things are something that if we can achieve those in the long run, I think we've done something decent.
You said something about peace. Do you think it's a possibility that the private sector can advocate for stranded people, I mean refugees? Let's say you go to the government of the DRC and say, hey, you see there are more than 300,000 of your people stranded in Uganda. They don't have access to education, they don't have a desired shelter, and it would be more than amazing if they return to their country. Do you think this is something that is a possibility for the private sector to engage in hard conversations like this with governments to make sure that they take ownership and we can see these people return to their home countries, and I do believe it would be one big step towards addressing the matter. Do you think this is a possibility?
Why not? My contention is that some of these conversations are happening behind closed doors, quietly. What we'd love to see is our captains of industry talking about this a bit louder. And so yes, the example you just gave. Imagine if one of the most successful companies in Africa, one of the wealthiest people in Africa, goes to a government and says to a government, you have 300,000 nationals stuck somewhere. I will invest, I don't know, $200 million in certain businesses, and we will upscale and bring some of these people back to country to actually work together. The condition is peace. Yeah. The condition is stability. Right. The condition is XYZ. Because why would the government say no to that, in my opinion? Yeah. And for the private sector actor, it's called first mover advantage. I brought business to this country. I invested in this country. I worked with government side by side to build infrastructure and FMCG. I make money. Yeah. And as I make money, I also help community. As I help community, I'm producing the next generation of employees for myself. As I'm doing that, I'm causing a multiplier effect for those people to create businesses to add value to my business. Yeah. Of course. And for government, it's taxable revenue. Why not? You get more money from taxes. For government, you don't have to worry about these 300,000 people, where they're going to come, are they going to come? Someone is helping. And I think actually what you're talking about, Sam, should come from the private sector, not from the government. I think private sector actors need to be bolder need to be bolder in what they hold in their hand. African private sector individuals who have big organizations that transcend borders have access to capital, which means you have clout.
Yeah.
Why not? And in business, again, fragile markets, in my opinion, high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
Why not? Why aren't we doing more of that? We should be doing more of that.
It's doable.
It's doable.
We only need to think big.
Inshallah.
Right. Right. Isaac, thank you very much for your time on Rwanda Television News. And as we wind up, I'd like to ask, what would be your call to private sector first, but also governments as great partners to see that we are collectively addressing this matter?
For private sector, it's simple. It's what I said earlier. I think for private sector, we would love to see a relationship where more and more private sector actors are contributing 1% of their resources to displacement.
Yeah.
We would love to see that, and over the next, say, 2 years, be able to have a list of companies that we say, look, these are the top 50 companies in Africa that are contributed to issues around displacement, and to actually catalog and articulate the benefit to them and the benefit to society.
Yeah.
For governments, I will say that we would love to keep pushing to create collaborative relationships with governments, because they can't do this alone.
Yeah.
And the private sector can also do this alone. And I think that level of collaboration and understanding that we're in this together, and the more we solve these problems together, the more collective prosperity we have, either on the government side through tax revenue for infrastructure, for private sector through profits, and community building. I think it's a win-win.
Absolutely. Mr. Isaac Kwaku Fako Jr., founder and CEO of Amahoro Coalition, many thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Right, and we can't wait to see this magnitude of the problem solved on the African continent, and you know, have African refugees contribute to the development of the continent rather than being a liability and a big problem. And we end it here, but we'll keep it up. Stay on Rwanda Television. Goodbye.